Welcome to this COP28 Expectations webinar by Legal Response International. Today, I will be presenting along with my colleagues, Montserrat Madariaga, who is a consultant with LRI, and the director, Pascal Bird, some of the main topics that are coming up at the conference. We will cover loss and damage, the global stocktake, finance, mitigation, adaptation, just transition, and the cooperative approaches, or Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. By way of background to the conference, so this is scheduled to start on the 30th of November 2023 in Dubai in the UAE, and is scheduled to finish on the 12th of December, although climate conferences can sometimes run over. The first week of the conference will be taken up by the meetings of the subsidiary bodies, the SABSTA and the SBI, who are respectively responsible for scientific and technological advice and implementation. And the second week, that's when the Conference of the Parties gets underway, and there's Conference of the Parties for the three climate change agreements. So there's the COP28, which is the 28th meeting of the parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And the agenda for that currently has 23 items. There is the 5th meeting of the parties to the Paris Agreement, known as the CMA. And the agenda for this meeting has 24 items. And finally, there is the meeting of the parties to the Kyoto Protocol, and that would be the 18th meeting of that body. And the agenda has 16 items currently.
Hello, I'm going to talk to you today about loss and damage, and I'm going to focus on the topics that are going to be covered at COP28 and focus very much on these for today. But we have produced a loss and damage explainer, which you might be interested in accessing. And you can do so by using the QR code that is on the top right of the screen now. The first mechanism that was set up to address loss and damage under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage in 2013. This mechanism had and has three core functions around enhancing knowledge and understanding, strengthening dialogue and coordination among various stakeholders, and also on enhancing action and support. However, the focus of the work that was done in the initial stages after the WIM was set up focused very much on the first two functions, on enhancing knowledge and understanding, and also strengthening dialogue, etc. So there was a big push for coming from developing countries in particular to also focus on enhanced action and support. The WIM was reviewed in 2016, and its mandate was reviewed in 2016 and 2018. And as a result of this review, the Santiago Network was established with the idea that it would focus more on action and support. The mandate of the network is to catalyze technical assistance of organization, bodies, network, and expert. At COP26, the network's function were agreed, and it was also agreed that the network would be provided with funds to support the technical assistance of organizations, etc. Then the following year, at COP27, the parties agreed the institutional arrangement for the network, in particular, its structure comprising a hosted secretariat, an advisory board to guide and supervise the secretariat, and a network of organization bodies, networks, and experts, which are known as OBNEs. However, in Bonn, in June this year, parties started discussing the potential host for the secretariat. The two candidates had been put forward, but by the end of the session, they could not agree on selecting one of the candidates. So one of the topics that is going to be discussed at COP28 will be moving forward on this and hopefully selecting a host for the secretariat. Another topic will be, and decision to be made will be on electing the members of the advisory board, and then also trying to clarify the funding arrangements for the network. So as I said earlier, at COP26, it was agreed that there would be funding to support technical assistance, but no details as to how the disbursements would be made, what would be the allocation criteria, etc. So we can expect, and hopefully we can expect more clarity and negotiation to flesh out these arrangements in Dubai. Another item on the agenda on loss and damage relates to the governance of the Warsaw International Mechanism. So the WIM, as it's known, was adopted and established by the COP and operates on the basis of functions that were agreed by the COP. However, Article 8 of the Paris Agreement incorporate the WIM and its function into the general architecture of the Paris Agreement, so that for the time being, the WIM is also under the authority and guidance of the CMA. So currently it is under both guidance and authority of COP and CMA. This has led to some disagreements, however, with, broadly speaking, developed countries in favor of moving the WIM slowly under the authority of the CMA, whereas developing countries, again, broadly speaking, are in favor of retaining effectively the status quo with the WIM being under the authority and governed by both the COP and the CMA. The reason why developed countries would like the WIM to be under the sole authority of the CMA is related to a cryptic provision of the decision that was a cryptic provision of a decision that accompanied the Paris Agreement that provided that Article 8, so the article that covers loss and damage, does not involve or provide the basis for any liability or compensation. The idea being that, or certainly the understanding being that if the WIM was moved entirely under the CMA, the issue of potential state responsibility for damages related, climate change related damages would then be excluded, wouldn't be excluded. So this issue of the governance of the WIM was considered last time in Sharm el-Sheikh at COP27, and we can expect that it will be again considered by both COP and CMA in Dubai. The functions of the WIM are implemented by its executive committee that reports every year to the COP and to the CMA on its work. So one of the other items on the agenda will be for the committee to report on its work over the year. One of the big successes of Sharm el-Sheikh, so the COP27, was the agreement that parties came to have a loss and damage fund, or more exactly, to have some funding arrangement, including a fund to assist particularly vulnerable developing countries to respond to loss and damage, to include sources, funds, processes, and initiatives under and outside the Convention and the Paris Agreement. Again, at COP27, a transitional committee was established with the task of effectively making recommendations for operationalizing those funding arrangement and the fund for consideration and adoption at COP28/CMA5. The Transitional Committee's mandate was to make recommendation on a number of things, including institutional arrangements, the modalities, the structure, the governance, terms of reference of the fund, different elements of the new funding arrangements, expanding and identify sources of funding, and ensuring coordination complementarity with existing funding mechanisms. The Transitional Committee was due to meet 4 times a year, but in actual fact ended up meeting 5 times because after the 4th meeting, they had not managed to agree on the main elements for the arrangement to operationalize the fund and a draft decision. So a meeting was called at the 11th hour, and was held a couple of weeks ago in Abu Dhabi. The main issues, there's a whole load of issues that are being discussed under these funding arrangements and fund, but first and foremost, amongst them are the beneficiaries. Who will they be? Will they be particularly vulnerable countries, or will they be all developing countries with a priority for the most vulnerable? Who will contribute to the fund? Will it be industrialized developed countries and other high-income developing countries, or will it be industrialized and developing countries, but the latter on a voluntary basis, or developed countries only? Will the commitments be mandatory? Will they be voluntary, mandatory for some, voluntary for others? What will be the main sources of funding? Public source, private source, loan, concessional funding, grants, etc. So these are some of the really high-level and top issues that parties have been discussing, and the members of the committee have been discussing over the course of this year. At TC5, so at the 5th meeting of the Transitional Committee, the parties and the members finally decided on a 3-part package, which was presented by the co-chair of the committee as a leave it or take it or leave it package. The text was, and the draft decision, etc. The package comprises a draft decision, a governing instrument of the fund, and then some draft recommendation for funding arrangements. it was agreed in the spirit of compromise and good faith, even though many of the committee members were not entirely happy with the package as it was, and had indeed expressed their reservations. And the US indicated that it did not represent consensus. The three-part package, though, will be put forward and presented to at COP28 and will be the basis for discussion and hopefully adoption at COP28/CMA5. The main element of this package are some of the issues that I've already raised. So in terms of beneficiaries, the preamble to the draft decision and also the governing fund indicate that the aim of the fund is to assist developing countries that are particularly vulnerable to the adverse effect of climate change, thereby effectively recalling language that was used in the COP decision that was the decision that was adopted at COP27. However, the text of the draft decision also provides that the host, which will be the World Bank on an interim basis, should host the fund in a manner which allows all developing countries to directly access resources from the fund, consistent with policies and procedures to be adopted by the board of the fund. So we will have to see to what extent this might be construed as an inconsistency with what the preamble of the draft decision and what the governing instruments say, and whether there is a willingness on the part of the parties possibly to reopen discussion on that, or whether they are just going to be happy and with the wording as it is. In terms of contributors, so developing countries, broadly speaking, had insisted that the contributors should be the countries that are classified by the UN, that were classified by the UN in 1992, when the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was first adopted, as developed countries, and these should be the contributors. Developed countries, by contrast, wanted to broaden the responsibility of contribution to wealthy developing countries, countries such as Singapore, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, so some of the Arab states. This was considered by developing countries as an attempt on the part of developed countries to effectively go back on the convention principle of common but differentiated and differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, and they were not happy with that. The US was also adamant that they would not agree with any obligation that would be a mandatory obligation to contribute. In the end, the wording that was agreed says that developed countries are urged to continue to provide support, and other parties, by which we mean developing countries, effectively, are encouraged to provide or to continue to provide support on a voluntary basis. So that is the wording that was agreed on that. In terms of the host, the developing countries had wanted a standalone institution, but eventually reluctantly agreed with a compromise to have the World Bank as an interim host of the Secretariat. They were not keen on it because they had some concern to do with the US having a possibly overpowering influence and ideological influence over it, over the fact that the World Bank would be levying high hosting fees, and some other concern. Some of these were addressed by the fact that the World Bank will, so for a period of 4 years, will be the host, but this is based on meeting some stringent conditions. At the end of those 4 years, if the conditions are still being met, then the World Bank will be invited, the COP or the CMA will invite the World Bank to effectively continue as a host. So there is no exit strategy, as it were. So the developing countries had wanted some assurance that after 4 years they could move to a standalone institution, but that request has been dropped, seemingly seem to have been dropped from the draft text. It's also agreed that the fund is going to be an operating entity of the financial mechanism of the convention that also serves the Paris Agreement, thereby reassuring developing countries that the principle and provision of the convention would be, that the fund would be under the principle and provisions of the convention and would be accountable to the COP and the CMA. In terms of scope, developed countries had wanted the scope of the fund to be quite limited and specific to particular type of situation and events. But in actual fact, what has been agreed is much broader. As we see, the funding is intended to cover economic as well as non-economic loss, including extreme weather and slow onset events, especially in the context of ongoing and exposed actions such as rehabilitation, recovery, and reconstruction. The board is going to be made up with a small majority of 14 developing countries versus 12 developed countries. It has legal personality and capacity. Importantly, this means that it has legal personality and capacity to negotiate and into the hosting arrangement with the World Bank, which were an important element to agree on. In terms of decisions that have been deferred effectively down the line for when the board has been established and is able to function, or issues around defining windows and sub-funds, and also identifying and working out a system to prioritize vulnerabilities, because although this draft decision indicates that the beneficiaries are going to be particularly vulnerable to countries that are particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change, there's no actual agreed definition of vulnerability. So it would be important, of course, to work out what we mean by vulnerabilities and how we can prioritize different types of vulnerabilities. In relation to issues that were not addressed, the big one is the scale of the funding to be provided. There's no floor or minimum finance that was agreed. Developing countries had called for at least $100 billion per year by 2030. but developed countries argued that this was not within the scope of the negotiations, and there was no agreement on it, so this was a drop. There's also no roadmap on how those funding contributions are going to come through. So what can we expect at COP28/CMA5? Well, there are different possibilities. Parties may decide to reopen the negotiation on this, hoping to strengthen some of the package, but also that present, of course, the risk of weakening some of the commitments that and compromise agreement that have been made. So they may decide that actually, in view of that, perhaps the safest course of action is to accept the text as it is and agree that it's not ideal, but actually it is something that they can all live with, and that there's still, of course, a lot of scope for the board when it becomes operational to make decision on very important issues, and so decide on that. Actually, one of the items that I have not mentioned is the source of the fund, and there is wording on this in the government instrument, which says that which seems to suggest that the main source of funding will be grant and concessional lending, but with also money coming from private finance and unspecified innovative sources. So again, we will have to see what in practice what this means, and again, this will be something that will no doubt become clearer once the board is operational.
The global stocktake is one of the most important and also more expected items for COP28, precisely because it's going to be the first exercise of this accountability mechanism, is that parties, but also stakeholders, are very interested and attentive to how it's going to unveil. The global stocktake is one of the most important topics for this COP28. As we know, the global stocktake was established as one of the accountability mechanisms in the Paris Agreement, and Article 14 effectively says that the Conference of Parties, acting as the meeting of the parties of the same agreement, so the CMA, needs to periodically take a stock of the implementation of the agreement to assess the collective progress towards the long-term goals and the purpose of the agreement. And it further mandates the CMA to do this, to conduct this global stocktake in a comprehensive and facilitative manner, and also in light of equity and best available science. Although there is no agreement on how equity will inform this process yet, as we will further elaborate. The same provision also requires the CMA to conduct this global stocktake in 3 main thematic areas: mitigation, adaptation, and means for implementation, which includes finance, capacity building, and technology transfer. And then Decision 1 of the Conference of Parties 19 suggested that the global stocktake would also consider loss and damage and response measures, which have been incorporated to the process as well. Then the same provision, Article 14 of the Paris Agreement, says that GST1 needs to be taken in 2023 and then every 5 years. As I mentioned, it's conducted by the CMA, but it also is conducted with assistance of the subsidiary bodies. And the outcome of this exercise is supposed to inform parties in their NDCs, so inform their ambition, and also international cooperation among parties. The outcome, though, is also not agreed. The form, although most likely it is going to be a decision. In this diagram, you can see the timeline for the GST1, the first global stocktake. As you can see, it started in 2021, and it will be completed in this COP28 on 2023. And it has 3 stages. So we have here number 1, information collection and preparation, the technical assessment of the information, and then the consideration of outputs, which would be perhaps the political phase. The first phase, information collection and preparation, gather submission documents, reports by the Secretariat, constituted bodies, submissions by parties, negotiation groups, and also non-party stakeholders, given the interest of so many actors to engage and participate in this process. If you see the submission portal for the GST, for GST1, it has over 1,000 submissions, which speaks of the level of interest that this exercise is gathering. With those submissions, the co-chairs of the global stocktake proceeded to the second phase, a technical assessment, where technical dialogues were established with parties and non-party participation as well. There were 3 of them, 3 technical dialogues, and also other events like a poster session, some work cafes to make it more interactive and also accessible for the various parties and groups and stakeholders that wanted to intervene. After the 3 dialogues, the co-facilitators developed this synthesis report, and they published it on September 2023, where they tried to summarize the key findings throughout the process, organizing them under the thematic areas mandated by the Paris Agreement and COP19. And so these 17 key findings follow a structure they begin with some references to context and cross-cutting issues, then mitigation and response measures, adaptations and loss and damage, and finally means of implementation. These findings also contain elements that are backward looking and others that are forward looking. So basically this exercise is at the same time spotting gaps or perhaps obligations that haven't been fulfilled and barriers to engage with further climate action, for example, and at the same time is seeking to get to some sort of agreement on how are those paths going to be amended, and so what sort of commitments do we expect to see for the next period. This after the technical dialogues and after this report, the Secretariat, also assisting the GST process, elaborated this synthesis report where they gather the views on the elements for consideration of outputs at the global stocktake. And this was published 1 month after the previous one, so in October, in preparation for COP28, and basically it gathers party and non-party submissions on these various topics, organized in the same manner as to facilitate comprehension, and also indicating what level of consensus or disagreement there is in each of the respective topics. So also assisting the parties in order to get to
phase 3, which is the consideration of output with all the necessary information and with a sense of also what would be perhaps possible to agree on and what where are the harder bits and points of disagreement. Then phase 3 is the one that we are seeing now, and is the political phase of consideration of outputs that will finalize with an outcome to be defined during COP28. So far, the SPs 58 managed to produce a draft structure, although it hasn't been completely agreed. But basically, it established a preambular section, then context and cross-cutting considerations, and then it proceeds to conduct the assessment. So the assessment of the collective progress, and this is divided in mitigation, adaptation, finance, efforts related to loss and damage, and efforts related to response measures. And then, of course, it touches on the mandated topic of international cooperation for climate action, and it offers some sort of guidance and way forward. So that the idea is that the output will follow all of these, will have something to say in all of these topics. As preparation for COP, there was a high-level summit in Abu Dhabi in October, and where parties agreed or developed this very rough output, which are just bullet points for a potential draft decision, following the same structure as suggested and as agreed in the SP 58, but not fleshing out these bullet points. So what we can find is that some of them are showing opposing views on the same topic. So clearly, this couldn't lead to a decision without a discussion, because both of these points in a certain topic couldn't end up being reflected in the decision. So, for example, some points of disagreement is the contributors base when there are certain calls for finance. So the same call for finance it could be directed to developed countries taking the lead, and at the same in a separate bullet point is the same call for the same finance, but also calling at developing countries to contribute. Then there's acknowledgement to some finance report, for example, and some points suggest that they're going to welcome UNFCCC reports, while other points say that they're not going to recognize them. So there is some contradiction at this point that needs to be sorted. There's also disagreement even on the headings of the decision. So moving to the third phase of the GST1, this is the most interesting one, perhaps, because it's a political phase where there's going to be a political consideration of the outputs of the GST. So in preparation for this, for COP28, there was a high-level summit in Abu Dhabi on the 12th to 14th of October, where parties agreed on a document that contains bullet points for a potential draft decision following the same structure as agreed in Bonn. However, these bullet points are not fleshed out and need to be. And at the same time, some of them will have to go because there are certain contradictions among them. So all of this will be object of the negotiations during COP28. It actually doesn't even agree on the headings for the structure. So as we saw before, the point about finance and means of implementation and support was suggested as such, but now, and because of the disagreement of parties on this point, there are 4 alternatives for that heading. And for developing countries, it is more important that means of implementation and support are the primary object of this heading, whilst developed countries rather focusing on finance flows and not means of implementation, given that finance flows could also mean private finance, whilst means of implementation and support include not just finance, but the capacity building element and technology transfer, which effectively has a more public component. Another, and perhaps the final event to prepare for COP28 would be was the intersessional that took place on the 16th of November, where parties were invited to comment on these bullet points and on the process as well. Some parties thought that it was inappropriate to comment on the text, to give big comments, because this was not a negotiation meeting. But most parties and groups thought it was a useful exercise, and they actually were hoping to see a more elaborated version of the draft decision that came out in Abu Dhabi as to support their work. However, the chairs clarified that there will be 5 joint contact groups during COP28, and no text would be produced in advance to that. The first one is going to take place on the 30th of November, so the first day of COP, and they will work there because they also agree that it has to be a party-driven process, as most parties were arguing. There's still the question of how the outputs will be captured, so which will be the outcome. Most likely it will be a decision, and a lot of parties think that a decision is fine, with a technical annex to contain more elements, and some parties are advocating for a declaration as well, in addition to a political declaration. From the intersessional discussion, so the last meeting, and also from the review of the views of the parties on the consideration of output, the main elements that we can highlight are that first, most parties agree on keeping the backward-looking and forward-looking approach to this exercise, where they focus on gaps and there's recognition, but also there's a way forward and a plan to address those. However, developed countries suggest a more positive view of the effort so far, and of their shared commitments. And they also hope that the forward-looking element doesn't have such a strong burden assigned to them, but there's a broader contributors base, if it's finance, or a broader understanding of this. Of who is supposed to share the burden of the respective commitment. Regarding cross-cutting issues, it is interesting to note that some developed countries oppose the inclusion of references to sustainable development, and also to references to principles and other parts of the convention, and they want to see a stronger link to Paris Agreement commitments and reduce it to those. Then developing countries, of course, they do want to see sustainable development reflected in the decision in the GST. When it comes to mitigation, as I anticipated before, there's disagreement on the various references to equity and CBDR or CBDR-RC, common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, and also on how equity and CBDR is understood in the context of historical emissions and current and projected emissions in the decision. So, of course, developed countries would like, with a larger historical responsibility, they would like to see that element reflected less strongly, and then understanding equity as per the global stocktake in a sense that reflect better current emissions and also projected emissions. When it comes to adaptation, developing countries primarily aim for some sort of balance between the adaptation and mitigation commitments and support. This has been for a long time something that is pending to give the importance to the adaptation pillar to the same level as it is given to the mitigation pillar. And there's a lot of references. There are plenty of references in their submissions and in their interventions during the intersessional discussion to the need to address maladaptation, because in the backward element, when it comes to adaptation, there are severe findings of maladaptation. So they hope this is something that the GST is able to reflect and address strongly for the forward-looking element as well. And then finally, when it comes to finance, developing countries are hoping to get a strong recognition of the failure to deliver the 100 billion goal, and also they want to see more references to developed countries' commitment to take the lead when it comes to financial obligations and commitments. However, developed countries would like to see some of these commitments also being shared by the developing countries and expanding the contributor space of various financial obligations. And then finally, developed countries think that the financial element is spread out throughout the GST suggested decision at the time, and they would like to see it contained and not in loss and damage, not in reference to adaptation, etc.
I'm now going to talk about finance and some of the agenda items on finance that will be discussed under the COP and the CMA agenda. There are quite a few agenda items that relate to finance, so I'm not intending on going into a lot of detail about all of them, but highlight some of the main one and most important one in there. So starting with long-term climate finance. So this process is aimed at progressing on mobilization and scaling up of climate finance. The collective pledge, which was first made in Copenhagen in 2009 to mobilize jointly $100 billion per year by 2020, was not met in 2020. There is, however, a report from the OECD which indicates that the goal might have been met by 2020. However, this claim is made based on as yet unverified and preliminary data, is disputed by some, so we will have to see to what extent it is actually true. If it is indeed true, it would, however, represent quite a symbolic milestone and to some extent help restore some of the trust that has been eroded between developed and developing countries, with developing countries being extremely upset by the fact that developed countries effectively did not follow up on their pledges. Developing countries are also likely to demand that even if the goal has been met will have been met by 2020, that developed countries still make up the shortfall for the years when the goal had not been met, i.e. for 2020 and 2021. We can also, under this agenda item, we can also potentially expect some more discussion around what actually counts as climate finance, and also potentially further calls from developing countries for increased shifts towards a concessional-based finance and grants rather than loans. One of the other agenda items that is going to be covered is our matters related to the Standing Committee on Finance. So there is, and one of the items there will be the consideration of the report on the work of the committee on definition of climate finance in use that could be considered within the UNFCCC process. There is no, as yet, there is no agreed definition of climate finance. However, the committee has its own operational definition of climate finance, and so part of the report on this will be on its work, the work that it has done in updating effectively its working definitions. Another item that will be discussed under the Standing Committee on Finance will be the report on the goal of doubling adaptation of finance. So in Glasgow in 2026, in COP26, the Glasgow Pact had called on developed countries to at least double their collective provision of climate finance for adaptation from 2019 levels by 2025. So there will be a report of the committee on that to see where we are on this issue. The OECD report that I mentioned earlier seems to indicate that there's actually been a decrease in adaptation funding. So it doesn't look as if we are on track there for doubling of adaptation finance by 2025. I will also mention that there's an additional agenda item that has been requested by Bolivia on doubling of adaptation finance as part of efforts towards the implementation of the Glasgow Pact decision on this. Then the GCF and the GEF both report annually to the COP on the implementation of the guidance that they have received at the previous session. So the COP will be invited to provide guidance to the GCF and to the GEF, respectively, on their respective policy program and program priorities and eligibility criteria, taking into account their reports, so the report of respectively GCF, GEF, and also Standing Committee on Finance. The only one I will mention again here are the matters related to the Adaptation Fund. So the board of the Adaptation Fund will update the CMA on the support to assist developing countries in meeting their adaptation commitment under the Paris Agreement. We can also expect some discussion around eligibility to the board of the Adaptation Fund as a result of the Adaptation Fund transitioning to be exclusively, to serve exclusively the Paris Agreement. So the issue here is that parties to the PA that are not parties to the Kyoto Protocol, and this affects particularly the US, would be eligible for membership of the board. This has given rise to tensions, and we may, because it might affect the decision making, taking balance. So we can expect these issues to resurface at COP28. There may also be renewed call, as they were in Sharm el-Sheikh last year, for broadening the donor balance under the Adaptation Fund. At COP21, the parties decided that a new post-2025 collective quantified goal on climate finance should be set by a CMA with $100 billion US as a floor. In 2021, the CMA established an ad hoc work program on this new collective quantified goal for 2022 and to 2024. That would include 4 technical expert dialogues, high-level ministerial dialogue every year, and annual reports from the co-chairs. So we can expect at COP28 the last technical dialogue for this year to take place, technical expert dialogue to take place, as well as a high-level ministerial dialogue too. The work program is then due to inform the CMA's decision in 2024, so at COP29/CMA6. Decision 9/CMA3 provided that the consideration of the goal would take into account a number of things, including the needs and priorities of developed countries, and include inter alia, quantity, quality, scope and access features, sources of funding of the goal, transparency arrangement to track progress, etc., etc. So these are the main issues that we can expect to be negotiated in Dubai. First and foremost, the issue of the quantum, or the amount of money effectively that this goal will have. In contrast to the 100 billion goal, US 100 billion goal that was agreed and pledged at Copenhagen, which was largely a politically determined figure. This time around, there's an acceptance that the goal should be very much need-based, so based on the needs and priorities of developing countries, and that clear methodologies and assessment need to, assumption needs to be need to be part of it to help set the goal. Some of these assessments should be based on bottom-up assessments, so based, for example, on NDCs and so the nationally determined contribution, which all countries have to submit, as well as on their NAPs, as national adaptation plans, etc., but also complemented by top-down assessment, i.e. Reports from such bodies as the IPCC, UNEP, and the International Energy Agency. One of the other issues that are bound to be mentioned as part of that is the importance of ensuring that there's a review mechanism built into the goal to make sure that it remains adequate when needs change. We can also expect a discussion around sub-goals, the idea being that in addition to having one big goal, there will be sub-goals on mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. And we can there expect some discussion around clarity on linkages, on the linkages between this goal and the loss and damage fund. In terms of the sources, we can expect developing countries to push for concessional grant, especially grant-based finance, but also discussion would probably aim to clarify what particular type of sources and financial instruments are appropriate for different types of climate actions. There is also likely to be discussions on enhanced access. There have been lots of complaints on the part of developing countries about the complexity of accessing different sources of funding in the context of multinational banks, as well as regional banks, bilateral arrangements, etc., etc. So these negotiations, in some way, provide an opportunity, in a sense, to reset the dial in relation to that, and for developing countries to try and push for having those access procedures simplified. Tracking progress towards achievement of the goal will, of course, be very important as well. So this probably is likely to involve discussion around agreeing common methodologies and approach and accounting approaches. Finally, two more finance items to briefly talk about here. So one of the three goals under the Paris Agreement is a finance goal. So this is a goal that aims to make all finance flows consistent with a pathway towards a low greenhouse gas emission and climate resilient development. Historically, up to now, the focus has been very much on the first goal under the Paris Agreement, the temperature goal, and related to that, the goal of reducing emission. And then a bit more recently, the focus also has been very much on the adaptation and the global goal on adaptation. So this is intended partially to redress this imbalance with the acceptance that finance is, of course, key to enable the implementation of the first two goals. So understanding the scope of that goal is key. And as a result of that, a dialogue was agreed at Sharm el-Sheikh last year to exchange views on enhancing understanding of the scope of this goal and its complementarity with Article 9 of the Paris Agreement, which is the main provision on finance commitment. So there will be a discussion happening around this. It's probably worth mentioning that there's a sort of broad suspicion on the part of developing countries that actually part of the reason for wanting this dialogue is also an attempt by developing countries to try and move away from their very clear obligation to provide financial support to developing countries in continuation of their existing obligation under the convention, and also potentially redress and have more of a focus towards private finance and private investment and loan, and away from public finance and public funding. I'm not going to say too much more on this now. The last item here is an additional item that has been added to the provisional agenda. So we will have to see whether it is actually added to the final agenda and if parties agree to it. By way of very brief background, in Bonn, some developing countries, in particular a group called the like-minded developing countries, and later supported by the Arab group, made it clear that they didn't want to discuss the cutting emission and discussion around mitigation, the mitigation work program, and enhancing ambition, etc., on cutting emission, unless there was also an equal focus on financial support. So whilst parties in Bonn were trying to add an additional item on the mitigation work program, these countries at the time said we will not agree to that unless we also have an additional item on providing financial support, additional financial support to enable implementation by developing countries. So this item has been again added to the provisional agenda. So it is quite possible that we will have an agenda fight over this. This would not be the first time. We have provided some advice in relation to what happens if an agenda is not agreed, adopted at the beginning of a session or by the end of a session. If you are interested to find out more about this, go to our website and to our database, which you can access through our website. You can have access to the advice there. Many thanks for your attention, and goodbye for now.
On the topic of mitigation, there are two main items related to mitigation that are on the agenda for the conference, and both of these items come under the CMA, so under the parties to the Paris Agreement. And the first one I will be talking about is the mitigation work program. Later on, I will also mention the Article 6 or the cooperative approaches under the Paris Agreement. So the context for the mitigation work program, this is something that arose out of Glasgow, but going into Glasgow, there was a call from the Paris Agreement itself and the decision adopting the Paris Agreement that new or revised nationally determined contributions, the climate plans that countries submit, had to be submitted by before the COP. So new or revised plans submitted before the COP. For some time, some countries in the process had been insisting on the target of 1.5 degrees rather than the 2 degrees, as both are mentioned in the Paris Agreement. And there was an IPCC report highlighting how much worse climate change would be under 2 degrees than 1.5. And the same report also highlighted that emissions would need to decline by about 45% by 2030 if the world was to stay within the 1.5 degree limit. And hence, this was called a critical decade from 2020 to 2030. With this background and parties submitting new NDCs, assessments that were made before the COP of the new and revised plans showed that they were very insufficient in allowing the world to stay within that limit of 1.5. And so in COP26 in Glasgow and this is part of the CMA, so it's under the Paris Agreement, as I mentioned earlier. Countries came together and adopted the first decision under the CMA, which is sometimes referred to as a cover decision, where they stressed the urgency of enhancing ambition, which in this context means of strengthening mitigation targets. They also importantly affirmed the 1.5-degree target, and they established the famous mitigation work program. And as part of this cover decision, the parties established the mitigation work program to urgently scale up mitigation ambition and implementation in this critical decade. The focus of the work program is to increase the ambition of the current round of NDCs, covering the period up to 2030. Interestingly, for the first time in a COP decision, in a decision of the parties in this process on the CMA decision, there was a call for phase down of unabated coal power and for the phase out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. That same decision further urged the countries that had not done so to submit their new or updated NDCs before the end of the next year, when the next climate conference would be. And also, interestingly, it requested those parties that had already revisited and strengthened their 2030 targets to do so again by the end of the next year. And then we had a whole year until COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. And during that year, about less than 30 countries stepped up to this call to submit new or updated NDCs. During the conference, so this is the COP27 conference, the countries decided under Decision 4 of the CMA to simply repeat calls that were made during the previous COP. And they agreed that the mitigation work program would start immediately after the conference, and that it would consist of 2 global dialogues per year and investment-focused events. They also decided that the outcomes of the work program will not be prescriptive or punitive, but facilitative and respectful of national sovereignty and national circumstances, and will not result in new targets or goals. And importantly, they also agreed that the mitigation work program has to be consistent with the procedures and timelines for submissions of NDCs as set out in the Paris Agreement. Because you will recall in the previous slide, the request, the last bullet point there, the request that was made in Glasgow was to revisit those NDCs that had just been submitted. And so for some parties, this was in a way rewriting the Paris Agreement and trying to enforce a new deadline for revision a year later. So this year, the mitigation work program is being fleshed out. And we had in June in Bonn, the meeting of the subsidiary bodies, where the mitigation work program was at the center of an epic agenda fight. This is because when the decision was taken in Sharm el-Sheikh, parties did not set out when the work under this mitigation work program would be undertaken by the subsidiary bodies. And in the lead up to the conference, to the meeting of the subsidiary bodies, an agenda item to include it in the agenda of the SBI, the subsidiary body for implementation, was made by the EU. And once the meetings started, it proved that adding this agenda item was very controversial. And so countries started effectively negotiating without an adopted agenda while it was being negotiated. And specifically on the mitigation work program, even though this was not on the agenda as such, countries nonetheless started negotiating and launching the work. Later on in the negotiations, a negotiating group, the LMDCs, the like-minded developing countries, later supported by the Arab group, opposed the inclusion of this agenda item unless another agenda item was added on finance. And by the end of the session, we still had no consensus on the issue. So as a last minute solution to adopt an agenda, parties decided to adopt the agendas, but without this item on the mitigation work program or the one that was proposed by the LMDCs. So this is why, not having had an agenda item, the discussions that went underway in June in Bonn have been captured simply in an informal note prepared by the subsidiary bodies chairs under their own authority. So this is the backdrop that we have. Going into the conference in Dubai during the subsidiary bodies and the CMA conference, the Secretariat will be preparing an annual report. No, let me say that again. Sorry. Going into the conference in Dubai, there will be a Secretariat report on the global dialogues, which parties will consider. And this year, the global dialogues focused on just energy transition. And once they've considered this, they will recommend a decision for the adoption by the Conference of the Parties. So as part of a possible decision of the CMA on the mitigation work program, we might see language on phase down of fossil fuels. As the COP28 president has stated earlier this year that this is inevitable. Building on some of the language that has been found before in decisions related to mitigation, we might see this year language on fossil fuels. Certainly, the COP28 president has stated that their phase down is inevitable, so question mark whether that might be included if there is consensus. The COP28's president's team have also indicated they are calling for a tripling of global renewable energy capacity by 2030, and so we might also see something on that in the decision.
Moving on to adaptation and what to expect in this theme during COP28. I can say that there are various agenda items and negotiation streams that will touch on adaptation, but I will focus most of this presentation on the global goal on adaptation, given its importance for the process. So the global goal on adaptation was established on Article 7.1 of the Paris Agreement, where parties agreed this global goal on adaptation of enhancing adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, and reducing vulnerability to climate change, with a view to contributing to sustainable development and ensuring an adequate adaptation response in the context of the temperature goal referred in Article 2, so the 1.5 degrees. However, what this global goal on adaptation means, or which are targets are we referring to, for example, is something that is not yet defined. And the progress on this definition and operationalization of a global goal on adaptation had been very slow until the establishment of the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program under Decision 7 of the CMA3, so COP26 in 2021. So this decision established the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program, and the idea is that this program will last for 2 years. So finalizing during COP28 again, and they will carry this work. They're carrying this work jointly by the subsidiary bodies and the CMA, of course. And the work program was established with 8 objectives, and these objectives relate broadly to the full implementation of the Paris Agreement adaptation pillar, to develop understanding and methodologies associated to the GGA, because as I said, it's not yet defined, with an aim to contribute to the GST as well, so for the GGA to inform the GST in a certain way, then with an aim to enhance national adaptation action, enable communication of adaptation commitments, facilitate monitoring and evaluating systems, strengthen implementation of adaptation actions, particularly in vulnerable developing countries, and finally, enhance understanding of how communication and reporting instruments that already exist in the convention can be used for the purposes of following and progressing on this on the global goal on adaptation, in order to avoid a duplication of efforts. The program includes 8 workshops, 4 per year, and the chairs of the subsidiary bodies are in charge of determining the themes for each of these programs. And their original idea was that each of these programs was going to touch on one of the objectives that we have just seen. However, if we look at the report from 2022, during this year, the approach was more flexible, bringing various themes. So, of course, there was a discussion on the nature and characteristics of the GGA, because it's not even defined. Some discussion on good practices, on metrics and indicators and targets, also addressing support for adaptation, reporting on adaptation, then links to other conventions, and of course the relationship of the GGA and the GST. And the plan for 2023 was this. So, for example, in the 7th workshop, that's when the interfacing of the GGA with the GST, the global stocktake, was going to be covered. But actually, from the 3rd session of this work program onwards, much of the discussion has been focused on developing the framework and operationalization of the GGA. And effectively, this has been even more the case since parties decided that they will use COP27 to finalize, they decided at COP27 that they will use the last year of the program to finalize the GGA framework with the objective to having an adoption of this framework at COP28. So progress so far in this program has led to a draft decision that was adopted during the SPs earlier this year. And this draft decision sets the structure for the CMA5 to then deliver a decision on all of these topics. And this structure is not fully agreed yet. So, of course, there's a preamble and some acknowledgements, but then the most important bit is the framework of the GGA. So one point relates to the establishment of the framework, and then elements of the framework. And here, we can see that, for example, developed countries rather speaking of enabling conditions for the framework, while developing countries prefer speaking of means of implementation. Similarly, when we go to the targets and indicators and metrics, developing countries would rather seeing something more precise and strict, whilst developed countries are happy with and content with a more vague, perhaps, language, speaking of shared adaptation priorities under the framework. Well, then there's the link to the global stocktake, international cooperation, and then follow-up work and finance and budgetary provisions. So in this table, we can see some examples of where parties disagree on their positions on the global goal on adaptation. So, for example, when it comes to discussing the objective of the GGA, the developed countries would like to see more links between adaptation and mitigation, and developing countries would like to focus on the global progress on adaptation only. Then, as mentioned before, developing countries want to see a strong measuring system with indicators, etc. But developed countries would like to see something more of an experience sharing platform for good practices and methodologies, so something less strict. And then there are other examples as well. The framework, of course, which is the core of the GGA, for developing countries, is very important that this is centralized with clear objectives and a clear guide towards the collective efforts. However, for developed countries, the framework should also be clearer, but it should be more linked or more related to the adaptation cycle. On another agenda item related to adaptation, parties will continue the discussion on national adaptation plans, on their progress and challenges and gaps, both in formulation of and also on implementation of these plans. They had this as an agenda item for the SPs, but because they couldn't get to agree on a decision, they only agreed to continue this discussion during COP28. But this is not because the topic is not relevant for parties. Quite the contrary, we have seen during the submissions of the GST over and over how parties stress the need to provide adequate support for the development of these national adaptation plans and also for their implementation. A related agenda item, or I'm sorry, not agenda item, but a negotiation topic that is going to be object of consideration during the COP28 is the proposal for an inventory of methodologies for assessing adaptation needs, precisely for the purpose of national adaptation plans, development and implementation as well. So this might be a tool potentially to be adopted to facilitate the work that parties have in relation to national adaptation plans. Finally, a reference to the global goal on adaptation and its relationship to the global stocktake. So the global goal on adaptation framework that it's supposed to be adopted at COP28 is expected to provide the actual system for assessment of the adaptation pillar in the GST process. So to effectively assess collective process in adaptation as per what the GGA framework indicates as how to evaluate that. Then throughout the reports and submissions in the GST process, we can see that the global goal on adaptation is also present. So, for example, part of this goal is expected to be a finance goal for adaptation, where countries provide, developed countries provide 400 billion a year by 2030 just for adaptation. That's something that we are seeing in various GST submissions. There's also a request that the balance between adaptation and mitigation finance is better reflected in a future exercise of the GST, because in this exercise and looking backwards, it is possible to see that approximately 2/3 of the climate finance are going to mitigation, and countries would like to see more finance going to adaptation, to adaptation, of course, leveling up and not leveling down. And then some other requests by parties in the GST in regards to adaptation and to the global goal on adaptation is the establishment of early warning system and climate service coverage throughout the globe as to allow better adaptation practices. There's a goal for addressing maladaptation as well, as the current GST has evidenced a lot of maladaptation. So that's something that the parties are hoping will be amended in the upcoming exercise. And there will be paths to correct that. And then finally, the GST will be conducting a review of the adaptation committee as well, so that will be included in the global stocktake process in regards to adaptation.
Another topic that will be discussed at the conference is that of just transition. So the concept of just transition in the Paris Agreement has a different interpretation according to some parties than that under the convention, so under the UNFCCC. So under the convention, typically this has been understood and applied in a quite narrow sense, where it applies to the just transition of the workforce that is needed and will be needed as a result of mitigation measures, which are sometimes referred to as the response measures in the context. So at the last climate conference, COP27 in Egypt, in Sharm el-Sheikh, there was a just transition work program that was established in the so-called cover decision, so in the first decision of the CMA, of the parties to the Paris Agreement. Some observers have called this decision a confidence-building measure, that was much needed to restore trust in between actors in the system, in between, on the one hand, developing countries and developed countries on the other hand, with developing countries really requesting for specific work to be done on just transition in a broader sense than as it has been understood under the convention. So at SB 58, so at the June subsidiary bodies meetings in Bonn, this was a joint item included on the agenda, both the agendas of SABSTA and SBI, so the subsidiary body for scientific and technological advice and implementation on the other hand. And here countries discussed the scope of this work program, its objective, its modalities, its inputs and outputs, and potential outcomes. However, the divisions ingrained in the parties in these negotiations resurfaced again. And broadly speaking, again, we can see a division between developed and developing countries, with developing countries envisaging a very broad and international program of economic transition that supports people, communities, and societies, but will require substantial financial investment. And that as a result, these countries are seeking, as part of the work program, a commitment to climate finance and to technology transfer. On the other hand, you have developed countries who are advocating for a more narrowly and nationally defined development priorities version of the program, in line with their vision with how this applies under the convention. And again, and still on the views of developed countries, generally speaking, the work program is envisioned to focus really just on the fossil fuel industry and to be a platform for sharing knowledge and best practice only. They don't envisage any commitments to providing support and finance, for instance. And so as a result of this, there was no agreement in Bonn at the meeting. So there is simply an informal note, a note that captures views of the parties, and intercessionally, so in the period between Bonn and until the COP, until Dubai, parties have been working on this, on the work program. They've been making submissions. Submissions have also been made by some observers to the process. And recently, on the 15th of November, the Secretariat published a synthesis report on these views. And there's also supposed to be a workshop and a report on the workshop that are prepared before the climate conference in Dubai, which, given we are 2 weeks ahead, slightly less than 2 weeks ahead of it, it bears a question as to whether there is some kind of delay here. But in any event, when parties meet, and so when they meet in Dubai under the SBs and as a conference of the parties, they will continue to work on this matter with a view to recommending a draft decision for the consideration and the adoption of the parties. And something that one might expect as a result of the conference would be a decision which sets out the main elements of how the work program will function and that allow it to start. Because at the moment, all we have is a mention of this work program being established in a cover decision from last year, but there is no more details. And in order for the work to start on the Just Transition work program, we would need to have agreement on the scope, on the objective, on what its functions would be. So would it be to share knowledge, best practices, lessons learned and experience, or something else or something more? On the modalities, on how this work program would work, what its time frame would be, the number of meetings, the kind of meetings, and what kind of topics will parties and observers be submitting on, and finally, what kind of outputs and outcomes would come out of this process. And last but not least, as part of our webinar, I'll be covering the topic of cooperative approaches under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which is coming up at the conference. So Article 6 of the Paris Agreement is an article that recognizes that some parties will choose to cooperate, so to work together on a voluntary basis to implement their NDCs, or their nationally determined contributions. And there's 3 ways, or 3 cooperative approaches that are set out in this article, 2 which involve some kind of market or buying and selling framework, and one which involves a non-market approach. The so-called rulebook, or the guidance for how to implement these approaches, was agreed at CMA3, so at the Conference of the Parties to the Paris Agreement in Glasgow in November 2021. And since then, parties have been negotiating further rules to implement the cooperative approaches under SABSTA, so under the subsidiary body for scientific and technological advice. I won't go in too much more detail about what cooperative approaches are, but if you want to see what the two market-based approaches are, I've put a QR code there which links to our explainer on those. So the first cooperative approach set out in Article 6 is under Article 6.2, and it refers to direct cooperation between parties transferring internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, so-called ITMOs. Under Article 6.2, parties are mainly elaborating processes at the moment for reporting and reviewing information, as well as the infrastructure for such information to be recorded and for the tracking of ITMOs. So from the last conferences, we know that the reporting requirements will include an initial report, a regular report, and an annual report. The latter is referred to as the agreed electronic format, and that these reports will be subject to a review by technical experts. And the infrastructure to record all this information and track ITMOs will be made up of an international registry that the Secretariat of the UNFCCC will set up so that countries can use it, as access to a registry is required to track ITMOs, but some countries might not have access to one. There's also going to be a database, the so-called Article 6 database, to record and compile information submitted and to support the review of the information that is submitted. And there's also going to be the CARP, or the Centralized Accounting and Reporting Platform, which is a public database to provide information on the cooperative approaches. So looking at the discussions on Article 6.2 this year, there is a big workload that emerged from COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. And some of these were now discussed in Bonn in June as part of the subsidiaries body's 58th meeting, and others haven't. So this is a work in progress list. So on reporting, there is going to be the agreed electronic format template, which should be tested and further developed so that a final approved version can be deliberated at COP, so as part of CMA 5. There is also, so looking at the discussions this year on Article 6.2, there was a big workload that emerged from COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh last year. Some of these have been discussed in Bonn as part of the subsidiaries bodies meeting in June, but others haven't. So it's a working progress list. I'm not going to go through it all. So some of the things on reporting include a final version of the agreed electronic format that is going to be deliberated as part of CMA 5, and also discussions of how to authorize ITMOs, the process for their authorization, and possible changes to this authorization. And importantly, how the timing of the first transfer of ITMOs will work, which is important because the first transfer is what triggers corresponding adjustments, which is a measure to avoid double counting and therefore ensure environmental integrity. This is a quite technical area of the negotiations, and negotiators who are involved in this process are increasingly comment on the difficulty and the complexities of the tasks. And so helpfully, a manual will be developed by the Secretariat, which will help with reporting, and it should be available at the end of the year. And there is also capacity building for reporting specifically that is going to be that is going to be set up. So that was on the reporting. Now looking at the two other aspects on the review, parties will discuss the modalities for how to review confidential information and also the scope of the reviewer's actions in cases where information that is submitted is inconsistent, and then how to process the correct data, how to correct the data in the system. So in the system or the infrastructure, there will be deliberations on the role of the administrator of the international registry and the different accounts that are needed in the international registry, as well as the kind of information that countries will have to submit to the registry. There is then also a question of how to connect the international registry under this cooperative approach and the so-called mechanism registry that I will touch upon as part of the second cooperative approach, and how these two registries will interact and communicate, and what information will be shared. And linked to that is how naming conventions will be used in the registries to allow for identification. So this year, parties and observers have had, let me start it again. So this year, in order to advance on all this workload, parties have been providing submissions, have been attending workshops. There's been technical papers and an informal report by the Secretariat to advance the work. And progress was made in Bonn at the subsidiary bodies meetings in June, and some draft conclusions were agreed. And so what now happens is that these are forwarded on to the next subsidiaries bodies meeting in Dubai, where the discussions will continue under this item. The second cooperative approach, which is also a market-based approach, is under Article 6.4, which refers to parties cooperating voluntarily through a market-based mechanism that issues Article 6.4 emissions reductions, or A64ERs, as they have become known. So these are credits or units. This is just the name that they have been given. This mechanism is seen as a successor to the clean development mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol. And it is governed by a supervisory body, which, amongst other things, is tasked with, on the one hand, approving methodologies for the activities that will be part of the mechanism, registering those activities, and then approving the issuance of the A64ERs. So this year, under discussions on Article 6.4, again, there was a big workload arising from COP27, from the last climate conference, and some of these have been progressed in Bonn and others are work in progress. And essentially, there's two work streams, one which is under the SABSTA, under the subsidiaries bodies, and one which is specific requests and work that is tasked to the subsidiary body, to the supervisory body. So looking first at the SABSTA, there is discussions on developing further responsibilities of the supervisory body and host countries that want to host activities. And there's also discussions on the linkages between the mechanism registry, so this registry under Article 6.4, as well as the international registry on Article 6.2, and other registries that countries might have already, and how these will speak to each other and interact. There is also discussions on the timing and relevant information that a host country has to provide in its statement authorizing the A64ERs and any potential revisions to this statement. The supervisory body has been very active, has had many meetings this year, and has been focusing, has had many meetings this year, and from the workload that emerged from the last conference, needs to elaborate requirements for activities involving removals, needs to elaborate methodologies for activities under the new mechanism, and also needs to develop procedures and processes that are needed to transition certain clean development mechanism activities to the new Article 6.4 mechanism. In Bonn, again at SB 58, the subsidiaries bodies meeting, the parties made progress on some of these topics and they agreed draft conclusions, and these will now be forwarded to the conference, the climate conference coming up, and continue discussions there in that forum with a view to a decision being adopted that further elaborates and sets out the guidance needed to implement both the ITMOs, Article 6.2, and this mechanism under Article 6.4. The third and final cooperative approach that's mentioned in Article 6 is under Article 6.8 and is referred to as a non-market approach. The third and final cooperative approach under Article 6.8, the third and final cooperative approach under Article 6 is found at Article 6.8 and is a framework to promote non-market approaches to allow parties to cooperate to achieve their NDCs, their nationally determined contribution, without a market-based approach. And coming out of Glasgow at CMA3, this is where parties fleshed out really how this framework will look like and have started to make provisions for a work program under this framework. And they confirm that NMAs or non-market approaches are voluntary cooperative actions that are not reliant on market-based approaches and do not include transactions or quid pro quo operations. So in order to flesh out, develop and implement the framework for NMAs and the work program under it, they established the Glasgow Committee on NMAs. At the last climate conference in Sharm el-Sheikh during COP27, the parties adopted a schedule for implementing the work program, which will be in 2 phases. So we are now in the first phase, where mainly the focus is to identify and frame all relevant elements of the work program activities and to operationalize a platform that will allow parties, and to operationalize a platform that will allow parties to record and exchange information on NMAs, so that, for example, parties can be connected with those who are, on the one hand, seeking support and others who are making support available. The second phase of the work program is then to fully implement the work program activities, among others by drawing on the results and inputs from the first phase. So coming into Bonn, we had the third meeting of the Glasgow Committee on NMAs, and draft conclusions were agreed on the matter. Among others, the Secretariat is encouraged to complete the building and testing of the web-based platform so that it is fully operational by SB 59, by the climate conference coming up in Dubai. And parties and observers were also invited to make submissions on the key elements of the framework, which are summarized in a synthesis report by the Secretariat. So this is what it comes out from June, from the subsidiaries bodies meeting in Bonn, and going into Dubai, where the fourth meeting of the Glasgow Committee will take place. And so at the climate conference coming up in Dubai, we will have this topic coming up both in the first week under the agenda of the subsidiary body for scientific and technological advice, and then by the Conference of the Parties to the Paris Agreement, by the CMA. So what will happen is that there is a fourth meeting of the Glasgow Committee that will be held to continue implementing the work program activities and determine future action that might be appropriate, which will then be forwarded to the parties as part of the CMA 5, who will consider the report of the Glasgow Committee and provide guidance on the framework and the work program, and take any action that they deem appropriate on the basis of the recommendations. So a decision will capture that and provide these guidance to further develop the program. Thank you very much for watching this webinar. I hope you found it interesting and helpful.